The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, I am Olivier Guimard and I will be presenting the HOPEX v5 installation architecture. Just want to double check that you hear me. If this is the case, you can use the question panel to put some text here. Yes, perfect. Okay, so this is going to be an overview of the architecture and installation of the HOPEX v5 with some slide and some presentation within the server that's already deployed. If you have questions, then you can ask them on the question tab. If I don't have enough time during this session to answer them all, we'll have another session. Just to let you know, there will be a more in-depth session for the architecture and the installation with a more focused aspect. Here is going to be a high level. The session is recorded and we'll be able to share it among people that were unable to join today or for later use it if you need to. So the first point I want to start with is the new approach that we come up with HOPEX v5. It's the introduction of the Mega HOPEX Store. The Mega HOPEX Store is the place where you'll be able to download HOPEX v5. So that's a new approach where before in v3 or v4 you were downloading the setup in the Mega community. Here you'll be downloading the setup and the modules into the Mega HOPEX Store. So the Mega HOPEX Store provide everything related to major release, minor release, CPs, hotfix, wherever we call them. So this is where you will find everything. So you'll find the core product of HOPEX, but also additional modules that you can deploy that can be complementary to the default deployment. So the main point on this is really about flexibility of the downloads of what customer want to deploy in the installation. So as before, you'll have the minimum required modules. So when you were installing before HOPEX, you had everything, but now you will have the minimum required, and then if you want complementary modules, this is something you can deploy. I recommend you for v5 to have a look at the documentation, and this is really a strong prerequisite I recommend you to have a look to. Even if you knew the previous version of this documentation, there have been tremendous change in the architecture and in the installation process that even for skilled and expert partners, prospect customers, product engineer, you should have a look in this document to have a better understanding of the technology stack of the v5, the communication protocol that may exist, the logical infrastructure, the physical sizing. You'll find in this document here some explanation how to size and the infrastructure for the servers. And in the installation, you'll find explanation of how to deploy v5 and also how to configure IaaS. So during this presentation, we'll have obviously some overview of each of those items, but obviously there's much more details in those documentation that you can have a look. So let's dive into the architecture of v5. So in the principle, we are still a web application. So we'll have a web browser that will connect to the application. and it has to go through a web server. And we still use IaaS as a web server as a front door for people to access the tool. And then we have encapsulates everything that we knew of OPEX into what we call OPEX application server. You will see a lot in the documentation the short naming HAS, which means OPEX application server. And it's encapsulate everything you used to know about OPEX, which means the classical OPEX backend module that were usually found into program file, and the more front-end module that you used to know that were more deployed in IaaS. So this is a major change in terms of the architecture. We use IaaS only as a load balancer. What does it mean is that we don't deploy it anymore any file in this particular IaaS server. We just use specific rules to redirect the queries from the web browser to the OPEX application server. And we use it, of course, to manage the SSL certificate as before. And we manage it as well to manage the cluster. So if you are in a situation where you have a cluster with meaning several servers, this is where you define where the servers are located. There is another change into this new V5 architecture is that there is a new database coming in, so which is the HAS database. So we keep, of course, the system DB that you know and the repository that you know that contains obviously the customer data and the customer configuration or customization. And the HAS database is used here as a common database for all the settings. So everything you knew that were configured in a web.config file or in a mega.site.ini or some config.ini something, it's now stored into the HAS database. The purpose of that, obviously, is to ease the cluster deployment. So if you're on a standalone server, you probably won't see the difference. It's just information being stored in another place. But if you were in deployment with multiple servers, then in that case, you'll see that it's much more easier to change the settings. So in that presentation, we present the OPEX application server, and there are some complementary modules that may require some specific configurations. They will not be addressed during that particular session. So if we're diving into this architecture, when we talk about an application, there is always a question about the redundancies of component and the failover of component. So redundancy, we address it with the cluster. So cluster meaning we have several servers that do the same thing. And the failover, we address it with the ability for the system to restart automatically if ever it crash. So there was some component that you used to know about OPEX, which we called some of them the watchdog. We had keyword like MWS or MGWS Pro or this kind of process. This has changed, and you won't find those process anymore. There are three main components that you will find now that will compose of the architecture of the platform. The first one that you will encounter is what we call the instance manager, the HAS instance manager, which is here basically to just manage the failover. So it's basically here to make sure that the process is up and running. And that it will also expose some API to manage the stop, the start, and also expose a website to manage the updates of some of the instance. So the instance, you have to see it as we call the environment with the systemdb and the repository. And this is what I call in this presentation the OPEX application server. It's basically the web platform that contains everything that you use when you connect. That means the classical web page of OPEX, but also some new admin console that allows to do some stuff in admin. Remember, we are getting more and more web, so we're getting away from desktop components. So we try to have more and more features on the web. So as a user, as a regular user, if you are a process modeler, an auditor, an IT architect, you will connect to your given OPEX application server that has been deployed. So there has been some changes into the technical stack of the architecture, and we are more compliant with HTTP, HTTPS protocol, and the fact that we use specific ports to communicate. So we're going to see later on how it has an impact in terms of deployment and configuration. And of course, within this green box here, the HAS, we have inside what we call modules, and those modules have a certain behavior. Those modules are here to expose the web front end, of course, the web front end of HOPEX. There are modules that are more here to expose the business logic, so the backend or the HOPEX core that you used to just to call HOPEX. Some REST API that we have, sometimes some complementary technical modules, like for example, Redis to manage some cache. So in previous deployments, remember you had several services in Windows being deployed. Here they are part of a module of the green box here that we call the instance manager. In some situation that we will not investigate in this overview, you can have several instances into the same server. And this is also something that is very different than before, is that within the same infrastructure, you can have several deployments, several instances, whereas before you could only have one single v3 or one single v4 on the machine. Here you can have several versions if you need to. So from a pure technical point of view, the major change of V5, and you might have heard it in some of the presentation that you've seen from V5 now, the technology stack is running under 64 bytes. So the component that we need, of course, needs to be compliant with this stack. So the client, we are still compatible with the classical client. They don't necessarily need to be in 64 bytes. 32 works as well, but to be coherent, it's better to be coherent along the way. The web layer, and this is a major change here that we have. So we still use IAS, so no change, but we need to use two new components that are called ARR, which mean application request routing, and URL rewrite, which is here, as I said, we use IAS only as a routing mechanism. So we need to define the rule to route the request. We are compatible with from Windows Server 2016 or 2019. We are not compatible anymore with 2012. So if you have any customer that are in Windows 2012, they won't be able to use HOPEX v5. The technical stack that we need, meaning the prerequisite of component that needs to be deployed, are .NET Core, .NET Framework, the C++ redistributable of Microsoft in 64-byte edition. So if you had an existing server where HOPEX v3 or v4 were deployed, there are already the C++ deployed, but in 32 bytes. So you need to install the one of 64. And of course, the JDK is embedded in HOPEX, so no specific need here. And the fact that we still need dependencies to the file system for the must license or for the sharing of the folder of the environments. And in terms of database, we support Microsoft SQL Server 2019. So that's the technical stack. So each stack obviously will exchange with each other with the given protocol and given port. If we get a high-level view of those protocol and ports, that give this particular schema. Obviously, this is the web browser use the HTTPS protocol. We recommend that all your deployments are done into HTTPS for the simple reason that some feature will not work in HTTP. So if you have customers still in HTTP, they will have to, when they move to v5, to use HTTPS. The communication between the IAS and the application layer is also done in HTTP. And within the server, there might be several type of communication in HTTP or socket IP. But this is not really of your concern as long as the right ports are opened. If you need to know in detail which are the ports that needs to be opened to work, they are explained in the documentation I mentioned at the beginning, where you'll find all the ports that needs to be opened, the firewalls, the routing rule, and so on. And of course, the communication from HOPEX to the database. There might be some additional communication that you know of if you have to do integration with an identity provider, or if you need to do an integration with the email system, and of course the file system for sharing the licenses. So that's the high-level architecture. So in a way, not that many change, still a 3-layer type of architecture, and yet many changes that makes the installation being a little bit different. So if we look at the installation, there will be a few things that will be different from your point of view. First, when you used to download the MSI, you used to download a 2 gigabyte MSI that contained everything. Right now, when you download the setup, you actually download an empty shell, and it's only when you're going to launch the setup that you're going to be able to download what you need. So what we want to encourage as a scenario is the scenario we call online, meaning that the server where you're installing OPEX has an access to internet and can access the store.mega.com website, because this is where we'll find all the modules to download and install. We know that there are some situations where the customer has a secured environment, and in that case, we have an offline process as well. So I'm not going to go through all the steps of the installation, but I just want to give you a high level overview of something that is deployed and where things are in terms of deployments. So in that scenario, I put 3 servers, but remember here this is only a logical architecture. You can have 1 physical server that contains everything. You can have a 2, 3, 4, 5, as many servers you want, depending on the type of architecture you're in. So in the database, if we start by the database, not much change compared to what you know. Still SQL Server, some systemdb and repos, if you have 1 or multiple, and a new database for HAs. For the OPEX server here, you'll have a few changes here because there'll be only 1 services in Windows that will be containing the instance manager, and you'll have an instance of the installation you're doing. One key point here as well to remember, when you do the installation, you'll be prompted to specify if you are doing the installation in development, in staging, or in production. This choice has an impact on the features that are available. So for example, some modules are not allowed to be deployed in production. So if you are in production, you will not be able to deploy those modules. Some features are only available in development mode. So for example, the features to package your customization to be pushed in production, it's only available in development deployment. It's very important that when you do an installation, you choose the right type of deployment you're doing. If we look at the IAS configuration, there won't be much in it except from a web config to specify some rules and some rewrite rules to say where is located the HAS server. So even if this is physically with the same server, you still need to have those 3 components to be configured. What has not changed, of course, is the need of a share folder for the environment license and the must license. There is no changes in those areas. For customer, they sometimes want to secure the installation with a given user, so they have to create a domain user that obviously has access to the servers that the system needs, the shared folder, the HAS, the database, with the right access right in terms of reading and writing and executing processes. From a high-level point of view in terms of installation, we encourage, of course, the online procedures. So basically, you need to ask the IT teams that will install the OPEX v5 that they grant access to the website store.mega.com so that the system can download the component it needs to run. If it's not possible, then we have what we call the offline scenario, where you launch the setup on the machine just to download the full package, and then you'll take this package and you'll go and put it on the server where you don't have the internet access. Just a quick link of the installation procedure. You launch the setup, it will download the required elements, it will unzip the module, it will register the instance manager in a Windows service, and then you will be able to create the instance manager. Then you'll be able to set up some additional stuff about the database, the URL, the certificates. When you are doing a standalone installation as a developer for yourself on your laptop, you don't necessarily need to deploy IIS in front. But if you're at a customer location or if you are putting a server online on the internet, you need to configure IIS to behave as a front to be widely visible. If you are in a scenario where you are in a cluster deployment, you repeat the same operation for each server, and then you just need to specify that each additional server will join the cluster. And that's really a new concept in terms of the deployment. When you install additional machine, you specify that they join the cluster. So in terms of flexibility, in the past, you used to deploy several stuff in IIS in different servers, some SSP somewhere, some additional component here. Here, it's not working like this anymore. Each server contains everything, and this is a system that will manage automatically what it needs to avoid failover and stuff like that. And the modules, the updates that you do, will sync automatically across each of the servers. So when you update one server, each server will notify the other nodes to update themselves. And of course, you need to configure IIS in front. A quick word on the infrastructure. So here, what I presented is obviously the logical architecture. If we think about how you can deploy it from a technical point of view, you have as many combination as there might be possible in a 3-tier architecture. So the most simple for yourself in a single laptop, which means that you have IHAS and the SQL Server on your laptop. You don't necessarily need to configure IAS and it will work. A single server. So for example, you have everything here, IAS, HAS, SQL Server. This is the most commonly seen type of deployment that we have, for example, for our MCS SaaS customer or for small configuration. What we see a lot is basically customer having an existing database server. So they're going to put the database here, and they're going to use one server dedicated for IAS or HAS. And after, it's a matter of choices of the customer. So there's no right or wrong type of architecture and infrastructure. It's about if they want to leverage existing or not. And depending on the sizing, if they want to have several IIS or several HS server. Why should you need to have several server here? There can be two main reasons. The first one is about number of users that they expect. So if they want to have thousands of concurrent users, they will probably need several servers. But also sometimes they need to have several servers just for redundancy because they want to avoid failover. So they want to make sure that there is always at least one server up and running. So if one goes down, the system is not fully stopped and they can still use it. So I see there are some questions on the chat here that I want to have a look to answer. So if we look at the architecture that we mentioned here, and I'll come back to one slide, and which is this slide, and I think this is an important one. There is one database here that contains a lot of settings. And if for some reason you lose this deployment, you still can recreate this part and attach it to the existing database to retrieve your configuration. So if ever you have, for some reason, deleted wrongly the folder where stuff are installed, you can recreate them and attach them to the existing database, the server. In terms of architecture, as I mentioned, a lot of the stuff that were in the front-end module in IAS are now moved to the server here. So in terms of sizing, of course, it's changed the workload. So there's no need to have a big IAS server with a lot of RAM or CPUs, but there is more consumption here in the application server. So in terms of CPU or RAM, obviously, it's always tricky to answer this question for CPU, but there's one thing that is sure for RAM is that to run this box here, the server that you run it will need to have a minimum of 4.5 gigabyte free, just for the system to run with no user connected. After, it doesn't increase that much, but at least you need to have a 4.5 minimum free. So that means that for a server or something that runs, you have to count that Windows will consume some memories. SQL Server will consume also memories if it's on the same machine. If there are any other additional component running on the server, there need to be enough room left. One question about installation of V5. It's in some situation way more simple to install V5 than the previous version, but obviously that will be have to be experienced on the field, and that you will give us some feedback. I just want to take the last few minutes left to show you some things on a server that is already deployed. So let's have a look at this particular server where things are deployed. So I have my URL here that is connected. So this is the public DNS that is mapped to my server. On this server, if I look at my program features, there is the HAS instance manager that is being installed. So we see it here. So before we were looking at HOPEX v4 or HOPEX v3 and so on. So here we have the instance manager. If we look at the services in Windows here, this is what I was mentioning. We will find this particular HAS services that is running. This is what we see what has been installed. If we look at where things are deployed in terms of folders, there will be differences than before. So the HAS Instant Manager will be installed in program file. So say goodbye to program file x86. Everything is either here in this folder or in this folder. So program file you'll find under Mega, you'll find the Instance Manager. Most of the time you'll have nothing to do here. It's very rare that you'll have any problems here. Thing that you will have to place you'll have to go a lot is the program data folder. You'll find a Mega folder, and here you'll find an HOPEX application server. This is where you will find what you need. So you'll find folders about configuration of the instance manager, some config file, some binaries of what you downloaded in the version that you installed, and the folder where you'll find the executable that you used to know, administration.exe or hopex.exe, or the licensing module, and all the components that are deployed in this installation. If we look at IIS, as I mentioned, in IIS, we won't find anything much. So don't look for the 15 subsite that we had before. There's nothing here. Here what we have is what we call a server farm. So here we have one server farm reference that contain in that example one server. So I know that's something that can be a little bit weird, is that even if there's one server, we need to create a server farm. But think it about if you want to scale in the future, it will be way more easier to configure and to scale up additional server. And some rewriting rules. So this is where you'll have the new options that you'll have to have a look. URL rewrite, and you'll find the rules to redirect to the farm. So that may sound a little bit surprising at the beginning as it's a new approach, but basically the IIS will redirect to the farm, which is the farm here, and the farm will handle the load balancing. So if there's only one server, there's not much of a load balancing, but if there are multiple servers, it will handle the load balancing. In that particular server, we have installed in this machine two different URL, two unique installations. This is part of the thing I said at the beginning. We can have multiple installations on the same physical machine. So that's the good point. Each installation being separated, you can update one and not impacting the other. So that's very interesting in terms of updates. Or you can start to prepare the future version and only switch when it's ready. So the HAS database I mentioned contains all the configs, so all the web.config file that you used to know. They do not exist anymore, and everything is in this database. So you will find those configuration in the console of the HAS of V5. My last point for this time, because we're running at the end of this presentation, will be about the installation process. And I recommend the setup being online for the main reason is that the system will download the latest and the appropriate modules and versions. And it's way easier to make sure that you download the appropriate components. If you do manual selection, there's always a risk that you don't take the latest version or you don't take the appropriate version, and you might have a lot of back and forth selecting the right components. And that's obviously why I will obviously suggest this particular piece. And also because if you allow online and I don't know the password, so I won't be able to show it to you. If you allow online component, you will be able from the tool to view the updates and download the updates. And that's also the ideas of being able to ease the updates for customer. So we'll stop here for this session. So I will share with you a complementary timing with a complementary more in-depth session on the architecture and the installation, where we'll have a more deep dive on the technical aspect of it. Thank you for your time, and don't hesitate to share additional questions that you might have along the way. Bye-bye.